I will read our illustrious guest and judge, George Bowering's short bio. George likes to keep it short and sweet. George Bowering was born in Penticton, BC. He is a prolific Canadian novelist, poet, historian, and biographer, and the author of more than 100 books. Amazing. He was appointed Canada's first parliamentary poet laureate in 2002 and was made an officer of the Order of Canada in the same year. He was awarded the Order of British Columbia in 2004, and in 2008 George Bowering was one of the judges for the Griffin Poetry Prize, and in 2014 he is the sole judge for the Fred Cogswell Award for Excellence in Poetry. He currently lives in Vancouver, BC, and is Professor Emeritus of Simon Fraser University, where he worked for 30 years. George, please come up and titillate our ears with your scintillating words. You may get a bottle of water. Now pick the best one there, George. You got it. That was the best bottle.
Oh, you got one of those sloping diets. What is it called? Lectures. It'll. Ah, there you go. So far. I know that's not good. I get to Richmond from time to time and I get lost every time I'm here, and that happened again today. Is this working? Am I hearing being as? Yeah. And that's far enough away from my personal gate. All right. And so I got lost again on the way here today. But if we'd done this in New Westminster, I probably would have got lost there too, because as soon as I get out of West Point Grey, I don't know where I am, usually. But in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there were two poetry magazines that were interested in publishing new poets, and to which new poets sent hundreds of poems each. And these were the Canadian Forum and the Fiddlehead. And the Canadian Forum was a kind of a semi-socialist magazine interested in the arts and politics, and published in Toronto. And the Fiddlehead was a university, we thought, quarterly, published in Fredericton. And it was nice. It had a cover and staples, and it looked like a real, almost like a book. And but then later on, I looked at the first issues that ever came out, and they were more or less the same as the raggedy little magazines that we were making, little mimeograph things. Except for a couple of little poems, the first poems I ever published a century ago were in the Fiddlehead, and I continued to publish in the Fiddlehead. And as a matter of fact, my first book of stories, the title story, Flycatcher, was published in the Fiddlehead. And the Fiddlehead was Fred Cogswell. We didn't quite know what that meant, Fiddlehead. We thought, oh, that's kind of a pretentious sort of image, such as you get like in classical music, top of a violin, maybe. And I found out years and years later, it was just something they liked to eat down there on the East Coast, right? Fiddlehead greens. And see, the image on the cover of the magazine was a fiddlehead. Well, Fred Cogswell ran that magazine, and he started the publishing careers of an awful lot of poets who wanted to be in magazines, even on the East Coast. We didn't have such a thing on the West Coast until something called Prism came out. But it came out from the creative writing department of UBC. Fred Cogswell published more than 300 books in the Fiddlehead Press. That magazine, the press still exists. It has a totally different name now, which I can't quite remember. Goose Lane, that's right, yes. And a completely different logo with a goose rather than Fiddlehead. And Goose Lane is now one of the big deal, sort of, not Toronto professional publishers, but a publisher of important poets and fiction writers. And that started with Fred Cogswell as well. Those 300 and some odd books, and this was kind of important if you look around at the history of what was going on in publishing in Canada at the time, an awful lot of them were written by women. And I remember having met an awful lot of them and read their poems. A lot of them wanted to get on the balcony with Fred, I remember, and vice versa. And whenever they would talk to one another, they would compare how many times they had got out on the balcony with Fred. That sort of made him my hero in many ways. He was devoted. I'll give you an example. One was a woman named Luella Booth, whom I met in London, Ontario, when I was living there. And I think at least your first two books, I think, were published by Fred Cogswell. She was, her name was Luella Booth, but you know, it was more like, her first book was called, or her first important book was called Old Mama, which she wasn't yet. That was published in 1966. And most people, when they knew Luella, didn't think of the words Old Mama. They might have thought of, whoa, Mama, right? I'm not saying that that's why Fred published her book of poems, because they were pretty good poems as well. So, and I went on to meet a lot of other ones, but she was probably the first one that I ever met because we happened to be both living in London, Ontario. So Fred Cogswell was a guy who was like devoted to New Brunswick. And remember, New Brunswick had a history of poetry before the rest of Canada did. The Confederation poets, whom we all adore and fall on our knees and worship from time to time, were always congregated around Fredericton, although some of them went to publish in Boston and New York and so forth. So you're thinking of guys like Bliss Carman and those guys. So I want to, and Fred was a kind of, he was in their tradition. He took over the helm from those guys. So I'm going to look at a poem of his published in his first book to show you what I mean about New Brunswick.